My name is Seegmiller. If you want to contact me, that's my Twitter handle. It's the same as my name. So a little bit about me. I'm from Utah. I grew up here. I went to the University of Utah. Been married for a while now. If you look at my work history, I like to refer to myself as a jack of all programming trades and a master of none. I've done a little bit of everything from old-timey web development with Perl through to game development, desktop applications. I've been doing Angular for about 2 years, and even Android native Java development. So lately, I've been at Vivint for almost 2 years now, and we have a series of apps, both native and web, that are used to control like a security system or a home automation system. So with our apps, you can turn on your lights, lock your door, open your garage door. The list goes on and on. So when I started, it was sort of the goal was build a web app that works as good and looks as good as the native apps. And that was challenge accepted for me, and off I ran. So I'm very passionate about front end and making things look good and driving those pieces. And so that's why I'm talking about animations. So what I'll first just give a little bit of an overview of the ng-animate module, where it came from, where it's going, kind of getting started using ng-animate. And then we'll talk about using it with CSS, then using it with JavaScript, then using it with both, and then using it with either or. So that's where we're going. So ng-animate started in 1.1.4, and if any of you were in the teens, as I like to call it, days of 14, ng-animate was a lot more difficult to use than it is now. And you had to pass a special ng-animate directive, and you would pass classes to it, and it was still fantastic. I loved it. So we used it all the way from, I started there in May of 2013 up through November when 1.2 came out. I'm totally stoked when 1.2 came out, and that's what we're using now. Big changes coming in 1.4. Matthias will be speaking on that on Friday, so definitely keep an eye open for that one. I know I'll be really excited about that one. So just getting started with ng-animate, the first thing you need to do is make sure you actually include the ng-animate module. It's part of core Angular, but it's not actually included in the angular.js file. So make sure you include it. Make sure you add it to your modules list from your app.js. Otherwise, it won't do anything, and you'll wonder why. And I've done that a lot. So we're going to start talking about the two types of transitions. Now, ng-animate deals with two main types. The first is structural. So these are basically thinking of as things that are entering the DOM or things that are leaving the DOM. ng-if is the simplest example. If the condition is true, that DOM element will exist. If it isn't true, it will leave. And ng-view is kind of the same way. We're going to include some piece, ng-include, ng-switch, pick specific ones. ng-repeat is even the same thing. As you change your filter or your array that you're bound to, the elements will come in and out. So as we get started with these structural ones, to use ng-animate, it's really, really easy. All you have to do is have a class that's built correctly. So in this case, I've got a really simple DOM here, a DOM element just bound to a single property in scope, and I just give it the FadeInOut class. And I do the same thing with ng-include, I do the same thing with ng-view, on and on down the list. So what does FadeInOut look like? So starting with pure CSS, what happens when that element is first being added to the DOM? Angular will put an ng-enter class onto your DOM element. And then, as soon as that happens, it puts an ng-enter active class onto that DOM element. And then once your animation finishes, it peels all those back off. And it knows when to do that based on the transition time. So here we have both an enter and a leave. It's going to be a half-second animation. And basically, on enter, we're going to start at opacity 0 and go to opacity 1. On leave, we're going to start at 1 and go to 0. And I like to tell people, if you have one animation in your whole web app, just have a simple make things fade in and out as they come in and out of the page. Really simple, but adds a lot of spark. Now, notice there's a lot to do here with the specificity of our CSS, and that's just due to, we want to make sure that that opacity 1 hits, and it's not overridden by something else. So that's the FadeInOut.ng-enter active. I don't like pure CSS, so I'm going to be showing things using Compass and Sass, which I think just makes it a little bit clearer. So this is the exact same code, but notice we use this ampersand syntax here, which basically just means it's a direct child of that. And so it's exactly the same thing. We also get to abstract away some of our prefixes around transitions using Compass, the Compass mix in there. But it does the same thing. So when ng-enter is applied, we start at opacity 0, we go to 1. We can use this variable transition time and repeat it. So that works. I'll flip over to my examples. We have a little ng-if example, and the Doge fades in and out, just like you'd expect. So next, besides doing transitions, you can also do proper keyframe animations. Works the exact same way. So again, you just have a class name. ng-enter is going to kick off that animation rather than that transition. And a little bit more involved with the whole Chrome and Safari like to be special prefixing there. But it does the exact same thing. So if you notice this one, all it does is it will fade. It goes to 50% over 90, and then it'll pop out over that last 10%. So if we go back over to the example and we look at the keyframes, you'll notice that it's what it does. So it fades and pops, fades, and then pops. I skipped over the ng-include, but it looks exactly like the ng-if. So this is just a subview that I'm including with ng-include. So the first gotcha when we're dealing with ng-view, which I just mentioned, is that the thing you need to remember that's different than ng-if is that actually both views come into the DOM at the same time. And that only happens when you're dealing with an animation, because what happens is the first one is going to animate out. It's going to leave. The second one is going to animate in. So as we come over here and we look at this ng-view example, what you should notice here in this broken example, because I'm not dealing with it properly, but the menu bar fades out, and then the Doge pops in on top of that. And the reason is because, like I said, they're in the DOM at the same time. So as soon as I do that, this whole menu with its whole page is sitting here, and then the whole Doge is sitting underneath or to the side of it. And that whole one has to fade out and leave before the Doge appears. So the way you deal with that is absolute positioning on your elements. So something as simple as just giving it a position absolute means that when the fade happens, they're allowed to sit on top of each other. And notice we do that in the ng-enter setup. So when we look at the correct example, you'll see that the menu fades as the Doge fades on top of it and going back. So that's one that, man, I've spent way too long banging my head against that one. And this can be a really tricky one to deal with if your particular animations require lots of really specific positionings, or you were depending on block positioning, and now you need to absolute position them just for the time that they're animating. So it can get really tricky. So it's something you need to make sure you pay attention to. Now, one thing I really like to do with ng-view is it's quite common as you transition through your routes, you don't necessarily always want the exact same animation to play. And this was particularly true on our app that I was building, in that our mobile app, so we were like responsive, adaptive, you'd go small and you'd get more of a mobile-looking experience compared to a large desktop experience. We actually wanted different transitions to play when you were in that mobile view. So it was more of a modal sliding up, the pages sliding over, versus something a little bit nicer looking for a large desktop. So one thing you can do is right where your ng-view is, and this does work, by the way, with UI view. If you're using UI router, it works exactly the same way. But you can just include a little class and put that into root scope. And so then what I do is in that click element, I call a little go function that says where I'm going to go, and that just gets set on the location path, so that transitions. But then I also pass in just a class name to use. And so that class name comes in here, gets set in the root scope, updates that class, and then you can do that. And that's actually what I'm using here. Well, you'll notice the broken one is broken, but when I go back, it's actually correct. Or what allows me to even just have a broken one sitting next to a working one. So that's a little trick that I find really handy, especially if you want to have different types of animations just as you're navigating around through your app. So let's talk about the second kind, class-based transitions. So the key here is that these have an add and a remove, and it's specifically, they're called when a class is added or removed from an element. So I'm mostly going to focus on ng-show and ng-hide, but they're all the same. So as we start looking at ng-show, there's a big gotcha here, because most people conceptually think that ng-show works exactly like ng-if. So if we come back to our example, and there's ng-if, and there's ng-show. They do exactly the same thing, right? Well, no, because in ng-if, we're actually inserting and removing it from the DOM. In ng-show, all we're doing is adding a class to it that tells it to hide, basically. And then we're removing that class from it. So when I first was trying to use ng-animate with an ng-show, I said, oh, well, I just need to have an ng-show and an ng-hide and ng-hide active. That'll totally work. And it doesn't. And you'll be sad. So that's the first one. So then from there, it's like, OK, well, what do I really have to do? Well, as you dig into what ng-show and ng-hide actually do, they actually add a class, a specific class called NGHide. So they're actually adding a class called NGHide. Well, because of the joys of double negatives, if you remove NGHide, you're making something show up. If you add ng-hide, you're making it disappear. So here is the exact same FadeInOut that I was using on that other page, but here it's on ng-hide remove. I show it up, it goes from 0 to 1. On add, I'm making it hide, it goes from 1 to 0. So this looks great. Well, this doesn't work. So now we have to look at the third gotcha, and that's that ng-hide has display none important, and that's important. So what that means is that if we now try to fade that in, that display none important is on that element the whole time we're trying to fade it in. So it's not there until it's done. It doesn't actually show up. So in our actual classes, we have to override that. And you can block, absolute, whatever works for you. But you actually have to override that display none. Otherwise, it just never shows up. And banged my head against that one for a long time one day. So that's an important one to pay attention to if you're dealing with ng-show or ng-hide. So moving from CSS, let's talk about JavaScript. So I'm specifically going to be focusing on the green sock animation platform. If you follow Matthias's blog, The Year of Moo, this is one he actually recommends using, and I've been very impressed with it. It just works well, it runs fast. My personal experience, it runs almost as fast as pure CSS does most of the time. And you can just do things with it that are just completely aggravating to try and do with pure CSS. So let's a little bit of how we do this. So back to the setup in our app.js. I just create a module underneath my main app module for storing animations in. Now, the other thing I like to do is add a constant in for tweenmax. Tweenmax is the core piece of GreenSock. So they also have like a light version and a pared down 4 or 5 different ones. Tweenmax is sort of the give me everything and I don't care how big it is type. So we do that, and then just like anything, we just added a class name of exactly what we want it to be. So over in our JavaScript, in that animations, and I'll usually in my project hierarchy, I'll have my JavaScript, my scripts folder, and then I'll have an animations folder, and I'll just drop in these individual animations. So notice I create an animation, I add it to the animations module, I name it, notice the dot, I name it literally exactly like I would a CSS class, and then I can actually inject tweenmax because I included it as a constant in my app.js. And then what I'm returning from this is a function that has a series, or an object that has a series of functions that basically just fire at a given set of times. So here's one that I would use for one of the structural transitions. So it's entering or it's leaving the DOM. And I'll show you what those look like. So basically, the arguments to those are the actual element that's being operated on, and then basically a done function. And that's literally what they call it. It's a function that needs to be fired after the animation is done. So here, we're using tweenmax. The arguments to that from to are the element we're operating on, how long the transition should take, or the animation should take, start value and end value, and then part of that end value object is the actual done function. And I mentioned it at the bottom, but don't forget to call the done function. And so the opposite of the leave, again, we'll just go from whatever opacity I was down to 0, and we'll leave. So coming back over to our examples again, I did this when I was preparing. I don't actually have a demo of that particular one, but we'll keep going. So as we move on to the next gotcha, it's back to this whole ng-show, ng-hide thing, which keeps just being a thorn in my side. So again, I first did the enter and leave. I got those to work great, and then I said, OK, I need to do show and hide. Well, it's got to be one of these, right? It's a show or a hide function or a remove or a hide add because I had a hide add in the CSS and an ng-hide remove. No, those are all wrong. It's none of those. So right out of the documentation for ng-animate, we have add class and BeforeHide class and before remove class and remove class. So these are the callbacks that are going to happen as part of that animation. So right before that class is added, right after that class is added, right before it's removed, and right after it's removed. Now, this is where things get really tricky because with a ShowHide, again, remember, we're adding the class ng-hide. So if we add ng-hide, it's going to make it disappear. So let's start down here. Now, again, remember that ng-hide has that display none on it, that display none important. So actually, before we add a display none important, this is the BeforeHide class, then we get to do our animation. And again, also notice that I only do this if it's the ng-hide class that's being applied. And that's another one that'll bite you is suddenly your animations will just start triggering anytime you change the classes on your elements. So if you're dealing specifically with a ShowHide, make sure you pay attention to that. So the opposite of if I'm removing the ng-hide, I'm making it show up. Again, dealing with that display none important. We actually just get rid of the NGHide class. We're done with it now because we're actually bringing this into existence. We don't need it anymore, and we just let it fade in from 0 to 1. So that's a big mouthful, but there's a lot of gotchas in there. And of course, you can combine both your structural version and your class-based version. And I have in my project, in all the projects I've ever used, I have a single a JavaScript-based animation that's just called FadeInOut. And it has an enter, a remove class, a leave, and a BeforeHide class. And it just covers all the cases. So let's actually move on and talk about really, I mean, that's a basic example that you can do just as well with CSS as you can with JavaScript. So let's talk about where GreenSock really starts to shine. So sequencing. So we can make an animation that actually does multiple things in order. So animate some piece, then a different piece, and then a third piece. So if you look at what we're doing here, we're going to fade the element in. When that's done, we're going to actually, we're using a from to here, so we're going to go from 0 to 200 over. We're going to rotate it 90 degrees on the Z. And then when that's done, we're going to go from 0 to 200 down. And all of that's just encapsulated in, once again, a pure ng-animate. So all I'm doing here in this multi-part is I'm toggling a property in scope that's making, it's just an ng-if. That comes into existence, and it plays my animation. I'm trying to do something like that in CSS. I wouldn't recommend it. So not only can you do sequencing, but you can do lots of things all together. Now, this is where, let's say you need to both grow something and translate it at the same time. If you've ever tried to combine multiple 3D transforms, like the matrix operations in CSS, I don't know how many of you have tried to do that, but they interact with each other in ways that are not expected, I guess is the right way to explain it. And you can do it, and you can do the math and figure out, like, if this grows this much, I need to translate it this much more, and how that interacts. Or you can just use GreenSock, and you can say, hey, just go over some, I'm going to go 200 in one, 300 in another. I'm going to scale it 2 by 3. I'm going to skew it a little bit as I'm going. I'm going to rotate it. And I can just put that all inside of one very simple property. And I don't know why you'd ever do that, but you can. And that's exciting. It's so exciting. So that's some examples of where you can really do some really interesting things with GreenSock, mixing it with ng-animate. So what I'm going to talk about next is a way to mix them together. Let's do some CSS and some JavaScript. So the question is, why would you ever want to do this? Well, again, there are some things CSS just does really well. Opacity. Every browser can do opacity. It works great. But again, what happens if I want to just fade something in, but I also want to translate it and scale it, which again is something that is really hard to do nicely in pure CSS? Well, we can mix those together. So again, it's actually quite simple. You just have a class. You add that to your class list. Once again, this is exactly my FadeInOut class that I had in my CSS before. But now I'm also going to add a JavaScript version of mixed. And the interesting thing is that ng-animate will play both. It doesn't respect them. It just lets them both happen. And so here, I'm scaling 2 times as I'm translating, and I get to do fun things like element.width amounts of translation and element.height amount of translation, and I can move it over an appropriate amount. And that will happen in the JavaScript animation while the opacity is fading in as part of the CSS. So again, you see it fade in as it scales and as it grows and it fades out. So this is kind of a neat example of just a way to take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put together the best pieces of both of them, and really come up with something a little bit more interesting. Now, you've probably already thinking ahead of me, but we could actually pick the correct one. So in the land that I pity you that you're still trying to support IE9, IE9 does not support CSS transitions or CSS animations. But you don't want to just go all into GreenSock because it's slow. You want CSS is fast, it's the future, and it is, and you should use CSS. But what if we could do the best one based on where we're at? So what I've done is you can just go out to Modernizer, and I've built the simplest Modernizer builder you can possibly build that checks nothing more than if the browser supports CSS transitions. You toss that into scope somewhere in your controller, put it in root scope, it's up to you. Luckily, it never changes for the life of that app. And as a very simple example, any place that you include that class, you can use ng-class and just pick the right one. And so pick the CSS version if you can do it, pick the JavaScript one if you can't. Now this works, but imagine every place you want to add that FadeInOut, now you're adding this whole object, this whole ng class. Let's make it a little bit simpler. So what we can actually do is we build a class called FadeInOut, we build a JavaScript file called FadeInOut, and then inside of our JavaScript, we say, hey, why don't you get Modernizer and check to see if CSS transitions work? If they don't, hey, just keep going and you get to play it. Notice we don't even return this object at all if that's the case. And again, the joy of this works because if you can't play CSS animations when the page loads, you're not going to be able to play them when it ends. That's not going to change ever. You don't have to continually check it. Just check it once at the very beginning. And this works basically perfectly. I don't have a great, it's doing it there, I promise. But it's picking the right one. Theoretically, if you pull that open in IE9, it would still animate and it would look exactly the same way. So that's one of the great things you can do. So some resources. This little example I've got that I've been clicking back and forth is on my GitHub page, Seegmiller there. And you can get it. I have a lot of examples that I build out anytime I find something interesting. The actual ng-animate docs are pretty good, but some of these gotchas will definitely slip through the cracks of the documentation. As I mentioned, Matthias's blog, The Year of Moo, is really fantastic, and he really delves into a lot of these topics. I'm hoping not too much of this gets obfuscated or gets deprecated with 1.4 changes. I'm really anxious to see more about that and dig into that. But I think a lot of it might just be allowing you to do a lot of the things that required a green sock to do before are now just more built into Angular and more part of what you have there. And of course, if you want to use green sock, there's a great getting started guide. It's free for personal use. It's a nominal fee for commercial. We pay for it at my company, and it's not that much money. And it saves us more time than I care to admit. And of course, the other thing we use GreenSock for is not just inside of ng-animate, but we build some really complex directives that have really complex animations. So we mix Hammer.js for touch events, and we'll do things like really smooth dragging and then animate it back into position and 3- and 4-part animations inside of our directives. So there's a lot you can do with GreenSock that's not just in the ng-animate land, but just as a general animate function. That's it. Thanks, guys.